Colonel Potter, sir. Corporal Klinger. I'm Section 8, head to toe.
Sherman Potter smiles a lot. That is the first thing you notice about him, and it is the last thing most viewers ever think about. He smiles when he is proud of his people. He smiles when he is telling a story about his wife Mildred. He smiles when Klinger comes in wearing something outrageous, or when Hawkeye lands a joke that is too clever to ignore. The smile is warm and weathered and completely convincing, and for most of the show's run, the audience accepts it at face value. That was a mistake, because Potter's smile is not what it appears to be. It is not that the smile is false, it is not performance in the cheap sense of the word, but there is something behind it that the show only occasionally lets you see clearly, and when it does, the whole character shifts. Potter smiles the way men of a certain generation smile when they have decided as a matter of survival that the world does not need to see what they are actually carrying. He smiles because he is the commanding officer, because someone has to hold steady, because if he doesn't, nobody else will. And somewhere in those 11 seasons, if you know where to look, you can see the exact weight of that decision sitting just beneath the surface of every warm, reassuring grin. That is the truth about Colonel Potter. Not that he was hiding something sinister, but that his greatest strength and his deepest wound were the same thing. He was the man who kept everyone else together by making sure no one ever worried about him. Everybody leaned on him. Nobody checked on him. Sherman Potter arrived in season 4 as a replacement for Henry Blake, who had left the show and been killed off in one of the most shocking moments in American television history. The audience was grieving. They had loved Henry. They had built 4 years of affection for his warmth and his bumbling and his particular brand of accidental decency. And now there was this new man, older, straighter, a career military officer who called people by their last names and wore his rank with a seriousness that Henry never had. The audience did not immediately embrace him. That is worth remembering. Potter had to earn his place in a camp that was still mourning someone else. Watch the early Potter episodes with that in mind.
Radar, don't talk with your hands full.
Welcome to MASH 4077, Doc.
There is a quality to his behavior in those first few months that is different from how he operates later. He is reading the room constantly, adjusting, figuring out what these people need from him, and recalibrating himself to provide it. He is not rigid, he is strategic. He bends toward his people before they realize they need him to. Most viewers read that as Potter simply being good at his job, and he is, but there is something more personal in it than professional competence. A man who entered a situation where he was not wanted and made himself indispensable to the people who did not want him. That is not just leadership, that is a very specific kind of emotional intelligence that comes from having spent a long time learning how to make yourself necessary to people who have not yet decided to love you. Before we go further, drop a comment and tell us when Potter became your favorite character. Because I think a lot of people watching this had a moment where they stopped missing Henry Blake and realized someone new had taken up permanent residence in their heart. That moment is different for everyone, and I am genuinely curious when it happened for you. Now here is the first discovery, and it reframes everything. Potter is the only character in the 4077th who has actually chosen to be a soldier. Everyone else is there against their will. Hawkeye and BJ were drafted. Radar stumbled into a role that suited him. Klinger has spent years trying to leave. Margaret chose the army, but chose it because there was nowhere else for a woman with her ambitions to go that even Frank Burns, for all his reverence for military protocol, was more interested in authority than service. Nobody at the 4077th genuinely wanted to be in a war. Potter did. He enlisted young. He served in one world war before this one. He built his entire adult identity around the uniform and everything it meant. And he ended up commanding a forward surgical unit in Korea, surrounded by people who resented being there, who made their resentment into comedy and rebellion and constant low-level insubordination. And his job was to lead those people anyway, to protect them, to hold a space where they could survive, even if surviving looked from the outside like it was barely functioning. Think about what that means. Potter chose a life that placed him permanently in charge of people who did not share his values, did not respect his institution,
Don't hold a grudge, Radar.
Colonel, we have to do something about this.
and would have left the moment the law allowed it. He could have been bitter about that. He was not. He loved them, genuinely and without condition. And the show occasionally stops long enough to let you feel the size of that choice. If this kind of deep dive is something you want on this channel regularly, subscribing takes about 2 seconds and it means you never miss one. We do this for the shows and characters that deserve more than a surface reading, and there is a lot more coming. Here is where the character becomes something genuinely surprising. Potter paints. It is mentioned early and then becomes a recurring visual detail across the series. His office has canvases. He retreats there with his brushes when the weight of the camp gets too heavy, and the paintings themselves are telling. They are landscapes mostly, open spaces, the Korean countryside rendered in quiet, careful strokes. A man surrounded by confinement and death who keeps painting the horizon. Most viewers treat the painting as a charming character detail, a quirk, something to distinguish Potter from the other authority figures on the show. But watch how the painting functions emotionally. It appears most consistently after the episodes where Potter has had to make a decision that costs someone something. After a policy he could not bend, after a casualty he could not prevent, after a moment where being the commanding officer meant absorbing someone's grief without being able to share your own. He goes to the canvas, and he paints distance. That is not a coincidence. That is a man finding the only private space available to him in a camp where he is never fully off duty. The painting is the one thing in Potter's world that belongs entirely to him and asks nothing back. It does not need commanding. It does not need reassurance. It does not need him to be strong. And if you watch carefully, the canvases that appear in those office scenes are never quite finished. There is always more space on them than there is paint. As if Potter keeps starting something he cannot yet complete, something he will finish when the war is over, and there is finally time to sit still without the camp needing something from him. The older I get, the more that detail hits me in ways it didn't when I was young. Now here is the discovery that most people who love this show have never fully examined. Potter has a wife he talks about constantly, Mildred. She is referenced in nearly every episode across the seasons. Potter lights up when her name comes up.
To disassemble piece into above groups, place butt against...
He writes her letters. He describes her cooking, her laugh, her opinions, her stubbornness. He refers to her the way a man refers to the one fixed point that makes everything else navigable. You spend 11 years listening to him talk about Mildred, and you feel eventually like you know her. She appears in the series exactly once, a brief, sweet visit that the show handles with enormous warmth. And in that one appearance, something becomes visible that all the references in the world had not quite prepared you for. Mildred is not an idealization. She is a real woman, complicated and funny, and slightly separate from the version of herself that Potter carries around in his head. And Potter's face when he sees her, when she's actually there rather than imagined, has something in it that is almost relief. As if the version of her he has been holding together inside himself for months has been a tremendous amount of work. And here, finally, is the real thing, and he can put the maintenance down for a while. That is a small window into something enormous. Potter's marriage is not just love. It is the thing he built his emotional life around when the army took everything else. Mildred is not a supporting character who happened to marry a main character. She is the reason he can do what he does, the reason the smile holds. Without her, somewhere in the background of his daily existence, the weight he carries would have nowhere to go. There are scenes where Potter receives letters from home and reads them in private, and his face does something it almost never does in front of other people. It lets go. The composure drops just slightly, and you see a man who is tired and far from home and holding onto a voice on paper the way a person holds onto a rope in cold water, and then he folds the letter carefully, and he stands up, and he goes back out there. Most fans see those scenes as warmth. They are also, if you are paying attention, the most unguarded Potter ever gets on screen. Here is the moment in the series that I think about more than any other when it comes to Potter, and most people who have watched the show dozens of times could not tell you it exists. There is a scene where Potter has to write a letter to the family of a soldier who died under his watch. Not a patient, not someone in the OR. A soldier who died as a consequence of a decision Potter made.
Well, if you can clear this matter up.
Without taking hostages if possible. Colonel Flag.
Or failed to make, or could not prevent. He sits at his desk. He has paper in front of him. He has a pen. He knows exactly what a letter like this is supposed to say because he has written versions of it before, more times than anyone should have to, and the camera holds on him for a moment longer than it needs to before he begins writing. He does not cry. Potter almost never cries on screen, but in that held moment you can see something passing through him, something that he immediately gathers back up and tucks away in whatever part of himself holds all the other things he cannot put down and cannot show. And then he writes, carefully, with the particular precision of a man who understands that words sent to the grieving carry a weight that ordinary words do not. The scene is short, the show moves on to something else. And that moment of Potter sitting alone with an impossible task is left behind like a room that everyone forgot to look into. That is the show's relationship with Potter in miniature. It gives you the glimpse, it trusts you to stay with it, and it moves on before most people have finished feeling it. Here is something the show did that I'm not sure it fully intended. Potter is the only character in the 4077th who carries a memory of a previous war. He served in World War I. He was there. And this fact, which should be enormous and defining and the source of endless dramatic territory, is largely treated by the show as a source of old-timer jokes and gentle ribbing about his age. The other characters affectionately mock him for it. He takes it well, he smiles, he plays along. But occasionally, without warning, the World War I service surfaces in a completely different register. There is a moment in one of the later seasons where Potter is confronted with a level of futility
Okay, let's say I overreacted a little.
Let's say
that even his considerable reserves of professional composure cannot fully absorb. And what comes out of him is not the coping mechanism of a man dealing with Korea. It is the reaction of a man who has seen this exact thing before, who has been here before, who believed the first time that this would be the war that ended wars, and who is now, decades later, watching young men die in a different country for reasons that feel just as insufficient. When you understand that Potter entered World War I as a young man full of conviction, and came out the other side with enough of that conviction intact to re-enlist and then serve again in Korea, you are looking at something that requires a moment to process. That is not stubbornness. That is not blind institutional loyalty. That is a man who, despite everything he has seen, continues to believe that his presence in these places matters. That someone being there with authority and care and genuine responsibility is better than no one being there at all. He keeps showing up to the worst possible posting because he cannot bear the thought of what it would look like without someone like him in it. That belief is the most painful thing about him, and the show almost never looks at it directly. Now here is something that requires watching Potter against himself across multiple seasons to see properly. There is a version of Potter that the army designed, crisp, hierarchical, respectful of chain of command and institutional protocol. A man who follows orders, enforces regulations, and keeps his personal feelings well clear of his professional decisions. That version of Potter exists. You can see him when generals visit the camp, or when official army correspondence arrives, or when some regulation arrives from HQ that Potter privately disagrees with, but publicly upholds because that is what his decades of service have shaped him to do. And then there is the Potter who actually runs the 4077, who bends rules, constantly to protect his surgeon's ability to operate the way they need to operate, who looks the other way at the still, who tolerates Hawkeye's insubordination at a level that no strictly orthodox commanding officer would permit, who signs off on things with the lightest possible pen when rigidity would cost someone something real, and who fights the institution he loves on behalf of the people the institution is supposed to serve. Those two Potters are in conflict every single episode. And the show presents this conflict so smoothly, so naturally, that most viewers absorb it as character consistency rather than character tension. But it is tension. Every time Potter bends a rule, he is choosing his people over his institution. And every time he enforces one, he is choosing his institution over his people. He never makes either choice easily, he just makes it quietly. And then he smiles and the moment passes and nobody marks what it cost him. That is the deepest version of the Potter story, a man suspended between two loyalties that are not always compatible, navigating that suspension for 11 years without ever letting the audience see the wire. Here is the relationship that defines Potter more than any other, and it is not the one most viewers would name. Radar O'Reilly is the character who sees Potter most clearly. Not Hawkeye, who respects Potter but keeps him at a certain ironic distance. Not Margaret, who reveres his authority. Not BG, who likes him enormously but came in too late to know the full weight of what Potter carries. Radar, the young company clerk from Iowa who is psychically sensitive to things before they happen, is the one who reads Potter most accurately and responds to what is actually there rather than what Potter presents. Watch the scenes between them. Potter speaks to Radar differently than he speaks to anyone else in the camp. There is a softness there that is not paternalism, it is recognition. Potter sees in Radar something he understands from his own life, a person who is more sensitive than the world has room for, who has built a functional exterior to survive in an environment that would otherwise overwhelm him, and who is homesick in a way that goes all the way down to the bone. Potter knows that feeling. He has just had longer to manage it. When Radar leaves partway through the series, Potter's response is one of the most controlled pieces of grief in the entire show. He does not fall apart. He does not make Radar's departure about himself. He says goodbye with a warmth that contains everything and reveals nothing. And then, when Radar is gone, there is a stillness in Potter's office scenes for a few episodes that the show does not explicitly acknowledge. A quietness where someone used to be. The show trusts the audience to notice. Most of the audience does not. And then there is the thing about the horse. Sophie is Potter's horse. She lives at the 4077th for much of the later series, And this is treated as an eccentricity, a commanding officer's privilege.
You know, a musical number.
Another warm character detail about a man who loves his simple pleasures. The horse gets jokes. The horse gets scenes where characters react to her with exasperation or affection. But watch what Sophie actually does for Potter in the context of the show. She gives him something the rest of the camp cannot. She gives him a relationship that requires nothing verbal, that has no rank, that asks no questions and carries no expectations, and does not need him to explain anything or decide anything or be responsible for anything. He can go out to that horse and just be a man who is fond of an animal. No role, no weight, no one watching to see if he handles it correctly. There is a late episode involving Sophie where something goes wrong, and Potter's reaction is disproportionate in a way that confuses the other characters. They think he is overreacting about a horse. He is not overreacting about a horse. He is reacting to the possibility of losing one of the only uncomplicated things left in his life. One of the only things that does not need him to be Colonel Potter. When everything around you requires you to perform competence and steadiness and authority, and something threatens the one small corner of your world that is just yours, the reaction is never really about the thing itself. It is about everything the thing is carrying. There is one more dynamic in this show that most MASH analysis completely skips over. Relationship between Potter and Hawkeye is not a friendship in the conventional sense. It is something more complicated and in some ways more interesting than friendship. It is a sustained negotiation between two people who need each other in ways neither of them will ever fully say out loud. Hawkeye needs Potter to hold the camp together so that Hawkeye can do his work without having to carry the administrative weight of making the place function. And Potter needs Hawkeye, though the show is more careful about revealing this, because Hawkeye is the conscience of the camp in a way that Potter's role will not allow him to be. Potter cannot rage at the institution he serves. He cannot make speeches about the moral obscenity of war without undermining his own authority. But Hawkeye can, and Hawkeye does, and Potter listens. Not always visibly, but he listens. And some of what Hawkeye says finds its way quietly into how Potter manages the next impossible decision. There are episodes where Potter overrules Hawkeye with a firmness that looks like conflict. And there are episodes, not many but enough, where the camera catches Potter after Hawkeye has left the room, sitting alone with a thought that Hawkeye put there,
First thing you know, you'd all go off half-cocked and act like a bunch of...
wearing an expression that has nothing to do with the commanding officer and everything to do with the man underneath him. He never says, "You were right." He never needs to. Potter is not the kind of man who requires the record corrected. He just adjusts quietly and continues. Watch the finale. Potter's final scene is one of the most quietly devastating things the show ever produced, and it happens almost in the background of a much louder ending. He says goodbye to his people. He does it with warmth and humor and the kind of ease that he has spent 7 seasons perfecting. He does not make it about himself. He does not let them see the size of what he is feeling. He sends them off with the same steady competence he used to absorb everything they needed from him, and then he turns to paint one last picture, a painting of the camp, the one place on Earth he never wanted to be and somehow cannot leave without grief. That painting is the whole character, a man who gave himself completely to something he did not choose, who found meaning in it anyway and who leaves it the only way he knows how. Quietly, turned away, with his hands doing something private while the world moves on without him. The sad truth about Colonel Potter's smile is not that it was hiding something broken, it is that it was holding something intact that had every reason to fall apart. He smiled because he decided, early and permanently, that the people around him needed his steadiness more than they needed his honesty about how much it cost. That is not a tragedy in the conventional sense. It is something harder to name and harder to let go of. He was the strongest person in that camp, and strength, when it is that consistent and that unconditional, is always a little bit lonely. Harry Morgan understood this. He played Potter with a precision that the character's apparent simplicity never required. In interviews from his later years, Morgan spoke about Potter with a kind of settled pride. He recognized what he had been given, a man who was good, who stayed good, who did not make his goodness into a speech. Morgan was 96 years old when he died in 2011, and he had worked almost until the end. There is something in that, a refusal to stop, that feels entirely consistent with the man he spent 7 years playing. Morgan had a career long enough and varied enough that he could have been remembered for dozens of things. He had been in films and television for decades before MASH. He had played villains, comic characters, dramatic leads. He had won an Emmy for guest starring on a different show entirely before he ever put on Potter's uniform. He was, by any measure, an accomplished and serious actor long before any of us met Sherman Potter. And yet, Potter is what he is remembered for. Not because it was his best performance in a technical sense, though it may well have been, because it was the one that felt most like a man being exactly where he was supposed to be. Morgan brought to Potter something that cannot be manufactured. A quality of having actually lived enough to know what it looks like when a person holds things together through the sheer sustained force of their own decency. You cannot fake that. Morgan did not have to. Potter never stopped either. Not once. Not where anyone could see. If there is a character you want us to look at next, leave it in the comments. We read them, and some of the best ones we have made started exactly there.